Philippians. Uh, our New Testament, a little bit of background, our New Testament is Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and that way. Uh, a better accounting of that, a better chronology of that, to do it chronologically. Why do we do it chronologically? If you do it chronologically, you get a better understanding of how this early Jesus movement, you really couldn't call it Christianity, and you really couldn't call it a church yet. It was not that far along. Uh, but you start out, and if you do it chronologically, you can see how the Jesus thing was taking hold. So, to your question, uh, prior to the Gospels, the earliest Gospel is Mark, probably written 68 or 70. Our scholars can date these things pretty closely. And parenthetically, the reason to do Mark then is it's to the scholars who read all of this, who can read the languages and all. Mark was written just prior to or in the midst of the terrible destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans, and that happened in 70. That's a Roman date. That's a good date. Took them a couple of years, but they really destroyed the magnificent temple that was ironically built by Herod in Jerusalem in 70. Burned, whole other story there. So Mark is the earliest gospel, but the earliest writings in the New Testament, chronologically, are the writings of Paul. Paul wrote, by the best information, Paul wrote in the 50s, Common Era, AD. We try to say Common Era now. Paul wrote in the 50s. Paul was probably executed by the Romans, probably by Nero, in about 65. So for a few years in there, the letters that Paul was writing to these developing Jesus groups happened, say, from about 50 Common Era to the early 60s. So in 10 or 12 years, what we have in the New Testament as Paul's writings occurred. Okay, so juggle that. The scholarship is pretty well agreed that Paul, they say the undisputed letters of Paul are 7. His name is on 13 of the letters in the New Testament. The better scholarship, or the scholarship that I trust, think that Paul did not write all of those. They're great letters. They're beautiful documents, but the way they get down into the Greek and all that kind of stuff, they say that somebody very close to Paul wrote these others. But Paul's letters are the earliest letter in the New Testament by most scholarship is First Thessalonian. The two Thessalonian. Now, all of these are the churches, or what we call churches. All of these are to the developing Jesus groups. Say somebody came along, Sammy suddenly has a revelation, and he's going to start a Phoenix church. And he gets 8 or 10 of us together. You really can't call us a church yet. You call us a group. And so that's kind of where this whole Jesus thing started. So Paul was traveling around, another whole great story. Paul was traveling around, and where he could, he helped establish Jesus groups. These were small groups of people, by then nearly all non-Jews, who could understand what Paul was trying to say about Jesus as Lord, Jesus as the Son of God, the kind of language that we use there. And so these groups came about. And the book of Philippians, to your point, Chase the Rabbit, is one of those 7, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Uh, yeah, the seven of them. I'll have to go back and look at it. The book of Philippians, it's really a letter to this little group that was forming in the ancient, very substantial city of Philippi. So Philippians, the people of Philippi are called Philippians. Uh, and the letter that we've been working on that, we'll finish today a 4 time, is the sweetest of the letters that Paul wrote because the people of Philippi were particularly fond of Paul, and Paul was particularly fond of the people of Philippi. Some of the letters that Paul wrote were contentious because the groups, the churches that were forming were all tangled up in all kind of issues. So sometimes he writes a very loving letter, but it's really a strong letter telling them to behave. You need to something. Okay. Oh, okay. Uh, yeah, okay. I closed these, but I didn't close this. Uh, and in the opening part of the book of Philippians, Paul talks about the joy that the people of Philippi gave him, and in turn he reciprocated. Now we know from the letter that the Philippian group had already been formed. In all likelihood, Paul, in his travels, had come to the big city of Philippi previous to the writing of this letter, and a group of people had agreed with Paul's word about Jesus. They what he was saying to them about Jesus made sense, and so they coalesced around that. Paul started the group, left, got in all kind of trouble. He was constantly in jail. And then what we have now is a letter that Paul wrote to the people of Philippi after he had already visited them, developed friendships, and moved on. The best information is that Paul wrote this Philippian letter from jail. Uh, we know from the book of Acts that Paul got in a lot of trouble and was in jail in Philippi. You know, Paul spent a lot of time in jail. And then he moved on. They're saying that he either wrote this letter from Ephesus, which was another great city, or he was already in Rome and might have been in jail in Rome. But pretty clear that the book of Philippi, the book of Philippians, is a prison letter that Paul wrote. That's a lot of information.
Why was he in jail so much?
Paul was countercultural. They didn't bother with his theology. He got in trouble in Philippi. This is in the book of Acts. He doesn't mention it here. A group of men in the city of Philippi had found a young girl, 12 or 13 or 14-year-old girl, who allegedly could tell fortunes, cards or somehow or another, she could tell a fortune. When she heard Paul speak, this is the book of Acts, when she heard Paul speak, she pleaded with Paul to free her from the demons. In those understanding, mental illness or whatever it was a demon. I don't think demons existed, but this was the way they understood it. And so Paul, in the book of Acts, Paul prays for her, and in the language of Acts, the demon leaves, whatever it was. And suddenly, the little girl who was able to tell fortunes was no longer making her owners or her boss's money. So they got mad at Paul and stirred up trouble and got him in jail because he stirred up trouble. And that's pretty much what happened in other places. And another, I have to go back. Y'all was so fun to work with. Another place, I forget what it was. Paul, in Ephesus, one of them in Ephesus, the goddess of Ephesus was Aphrodite. And even today, when you go to Ephesus, Linda and I did that a long time ago, the ruins of what had been a magnificent temple to Aphrodite is still there and outside of Ephesus. Apparently, Paul's message about Jesus took hold so much that people stopped having silver statues of Aphrodite made. You know, they put aside the idol of Aphrodite, and it hurt the silversmith's business. So they stirred up trouble with Paul in Ephesus, and he wound up in jail in Ephesus. A time or two, and again, in the book of Acts and all, these kinds of things happen. And he was left for dead one time. They beat him up so bad somewhere, I forget where, that he was left for dead. It didn't kill him, but he was pretty badly beat up. So it wasn't his religion or his theology. It was if he interfered with business. That's what got him in trouble. They didn't think most of them couldn't care less about his theology or his religion, partly because it was so polytheistic. Everybody had a god or a goddess. Every house had a little statue of some kind. Every city had a god or goddesses and so forth. So one more, this guy Jesus, no big deal on that. Just add that to the list. But when people began to believe into Jesus and it affected the business, that's what got him in trouble. So that's an interesting story there. But Paul loved the Philippians, and the Philippians loved Paul. And so this letter is a sweet. It's a love letter in effect between Paul and the Philippians. Whatever the dynamic was, they were very fond of Paul. Okay, so 4 chapters, and we're kind of wrapping up today. I'm not doing it exactly in order, but I'm kind of, and my glasses that's broken. I've got to go get it fixed. I'm gonna skip around a little bit because I want us to hit some high points here that I think are important. Uh, it, People have long debated about the flow of language in the book of Philippians. Paul is going along telling how wonderful they are, how they are following Jesus, and then suddenly in the 3rd chapter, right in the middle of it, Paul comes up with this language. He says, beware of dogs. Wow. Beware of the evil workers. Beware of those who mutilate the flesh. For it is we who are circumcised who worship in the Spirit of God and boast in Christ Jesus and have no confidence in the flesh, even though I too have reason for confidence in the flesh. Now, as you know, from antiquity and the way the book of Genesis tells it, from Abraham, it's probably a whole lot more involved than that. But from Abraham on in antiquity, one of the signs that God wanted to identify his new people was for the men to be circumcised. Uh, you know what that is. You had your babies circumcised and all. So and the Jews were not the only one from antiquity who experienced circumcision. If you think about it, if you just do it superficially, you think that only Jewish men experienced this. We know now that many other cultures did. Many years ago, I went to Kenya, to Africa, and did a tour, wonderful tour of the Masai Mara Park. The Masai men are these very tall, slender men. Nothing to be 6'8", 6'9", these slender men. For them, circumcision is important, but I don't know whether they still do it or not, but from antiquity, the young boy, as he reached a certain age, 12 or 13 or something like that, the young boy had to go out and kill his first lion. That was the mark. He had to go out and kill his first lion. And apparently lions were more abundant then than they are now in this part of Africa. Once he had killed his lion, then a huge celebration took place, at which time the males were circumcised. So he was 13 or 14, which is real, wow, that's a big deal. And that'd be tough to think about that. Uh, the other, most of the time now families want to do, they do it to the baby boy. And in Jewish life, the male, the baby boy, is circumcised in a family celebration on the 8th day. And there is a certain
Is that called the bris?
I don't know I don't know the Hebrew, but yeah. But in Jewish culture, there's always some man whose expertise is that right. So they get together, and the man, this, he's not a priest, but that's kind of his specialty. Uh, he does that bit of circumcision, bit of surgery on the male child at 8 days. And to say, but now for Paul he's way down the pike here. Paul was a faithful Jew, kept the laws, kept the diet, and was circumcised as a baby like all other Jewish men. So now suddenly, uh, non-Jews, non-Jews were becoming followers of Jesus. And the question arose, did a Roman man, a non-Jew, have to be circumcised in order to become a Christian, in order to become a member, a part of these Jesus groups that were forming? So this was a big issue. Obviously, it's a Roman man at 35 years of age was not excited about experiencing that bit of surgery, which it could also be very dangerous when at an age like that. But some Jews, some Jews, by now get it. By now, the Jews lived all over the Mediterranean world. They lived in dispersion, diaspora. A lot of history there. They lived all over the Roman world. So, for instance, in Philippi, when Paul preached, non-Jews believed his message, but also Jews believed, men and women and kids and all believed Paul's message about Jesus. And then the big issue arose: did did the Roman man who had come to believe in Jesus have to be circumcised and keep all of the Roman dietary laws in order to be a Christian? This was a big issue in these developing Jesus groups. Paul startled Paul really startled the Roman world by saying, I mean, this was a thing that he worked out over a period of time, startled the Roman world, startled the Jewish world by saying a man did not have to be circumcised to be a member of the Jesus group. So this was the issue here. For instance, in the Philippian group, in the Philippian Jesus group, there were obviously from the letter, there were Jews who had become followers of Jesus. There were Romans, who also, I mean, Greek Philippians who'd become followers of Jesus. Did those new converts, not Jews, have to experience circumcision and keep all the dietary laws of the Jews in order to be a Christian? And Paul startled the Jewish world and really opened the gospel to the world by saying, no, and that's what his word here about the flesh. He's saying, what you do to the flesh is of no consequence. What really matters is what happens in the heart. They finally, in the book of Acts, at a point, they had a big meeting, had a conference at the Holiday Inn in Jerusalem. No, they had a big conference in Jerusalem to decide finally, did non-Jewish men have to keep all of the rules of Judaism in order to be a part of this new Jesus group? And the group in Jerusalem, made up of Jews, said, no, you don't. You don't, a man coming in, a non-Jew, a Roman, a Gentile, as they call, coming into the Jesus group, came in by faith. He did not come in by a rite of the flesh. He came in by an experience of the heart. And this occurred a lot. The book of Romans has this, Philippians has this, other writings that the letter to the Galatians, Paul really comes down hard to say a man becoming a follower of Jesus is not a matter of the flesh. It is a matter of the heart. So that's his point here. And Paul is called pretty strong language. Those Jewish Christians who wanted everybody to have to keep the Jewish law, he called them dogs. Didn't mince words at all. So that's this gives you a clue about Paul. Paul was wonderful, but he probably didn't bear fools easily. So that was, and a lot of scholars have debated why suddenly this very strong, harsh language is just sort of plopped into the middle of this otherwise beautiful letter. And this was obviously an issue even in the Philippian church. So that was a pervasive kind of thing. Um, but it was really startling. Interestingly enough, while I'm chasing a rabbit, uh, a part a part of the book of Revelation, John of Patmos, a guy named John of Patmos, apparently wrote the book of Revelation in about 80 or 90. Paul long dead. Uh, John of Patmos was a Christian, but he was also a Jew and very Jewish. Uh, and by about 90, when the book of Revelation was written, uh, uh, the teachings of the freedom of relationship that Paul was preaching to the Philippians and others, that had really begun to take hold. And John of Patmos didn't like that freedom. John of Patmos was a deep Christian and all of that, but he was also still very Jewish. And so in the last 25 years or so, a whole new study of the book of Revelation has emerged that says that John of Patmos was a very strict Christian, but also very Jewish. And a lot of the language that we had previously laid on the Romans in these newer studies of saying actually John of Patmos was also laying on Christians, because John of Patmos did not like the freedom of belief, the freedom of faith that Paul was preaching. Paul wrote all of his stuff in the 50s and 60s. You get the idea that he wrote it all, and then suddenly people at their laptop and this stuff going out everywhere. No, we know that didn't happen. In some ways, Paul's writings disappeared, and we also know that he wrote a whole lot more than what we have in the New Testament. That's the way they communicated. They wrote letters back and forth, and somebody carried those letters. There was no postal service. Uh, I want to get to Joan, and Dean is going over her way, and I'll say, I want to write Joan, would you take this letter to her? Yeah. So it takes you 6 months to get over there because you're walking. Uh, but finally, my letter to her gets there, and you say, "Here, Bob wanted you to have this." Nothing like the instantaneous stuff that we have now. It, all it's a fascinating process here, and as serendipitous as a lot of it was, it is all the more amazing to me that this whole Jesus thing is as episodic and serendipitous as it was, took hold. Took hold. I'm writing a little piece and I'm saying that something happened in those years that nobody has ever really figured out why this Jesus group took hold to the degree that it did. Many doctoral dissertations have been written on that subject, but it's still just supposition. And we would say that it's the Spirit of God that carried this message and found lodging in the hearts of growing thousands and finally millions of people. Okay. So great story, just that part of it here. So, and again, what we're trying to do is understand how the Philippians understood what Paul was talking about, to try to get there then as well as our now. And we translate that to say that we don't want to create any barriers to belief and to faith in Jesus. And there really should be no barrier at the church. The church ought to be wide open, gay, straight, married, divorced. It should be wide open to anybody. And this would be Paul's message. And I think it was Jesus' message. No barriers to faith and no barriers to church membership, really. It ought to be wide open. Not everybody agrees with that, but I think that's the way to do it. Okay, how about that? All right. Huh?
I agree.
All right. The next bold piece here that I put in, Paul tells the Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven. And it is from there that we are expecting a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. He will transform the body of our humiliation so that it may be conformed to the body of his glory by the power that also establishes him to make all things subject to himself. And this is Paul's statement in the book of Philippians that he spells out much more definitively in that initial book, the of this initial letter of Thessalonians, that we have come to call the second coming of Jesus. The early church, the early Jesus group, for centuries, and it never has gone away, had a firm belief that Jesus, who went away, and the book of Acts says he ascended into heaven, that he would come again. And this is what we in common conversation call second coming of Jesus. Paul and those thought it was any day. Any day, the skies were going to split open and Jesus was going to come floating down on a cloud. This was very firm belief. Paul, very smart, PhD from, that's not really, very, very smart man, believed that Jesus, who left, who was resurrected, raised by God, would any day, any hour, visibly come back on the cloud, come back, and a lot of stuff would happen. As far as I know, it hadn't happened. If he came, we missed it. We didn't get gathered up in that. I don't think Jesus has come again. And in the last 150 couple of hundred years, a whole new picture of the so-called second coming of Jesus has emerged. It's not really very biblical, or if the women and men who put that together snatch scriptures here and there, and from the snatch of scriptures build a whole picture that really almost, if they say this is what Jesus has to do, he has to do all of this stuff. A part of the reason, this is really interesting to me, at least, part of the reason that a lot of I think, a more conservative Christian folk, politically Christian, are so committed to Israel, that there is a strong belief among this whole group of people that the temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt. And when it is rebuilt, this is the sign that Jesus will come again. So they're saying You have to take care of Israel so that Israel can provide a place for that new temple to be built, because only then, the way I read it, only then can Jesus come again. So this is why a lot of people, I think, are rather blind to the Israeli government. A lot of the really hard things the Israeli government does to the Palestinians, because they don't make the distinction between the people of Israel, the culture, the ethos of Israel, and the government of Israel. The government of Israel is secular. The government of Israel makes no official claim to be religious. Like we don't, our government is supposed to be non-religious. Now, that doesn't mean that not a lot of religious people are in the government, but we have the Constitution. The First Amendment of the Constitution establishes the basic idea of the separation of church and state. A lot of debate back and forth what that means, but this is it. I mean, and so a lot of people still believe in the. I don't believe in the second coming in this kind of way. If it happens, fine. That's just my idea that it doesn't happen that way. But that's okay. Uh, but was a very, very, very strong belief in their time. Paul and others came up with that idea from snatches of Hebrew scripture, the little bitty pieces here and there of that can help formulate the idea that Jesus would come again. And in the book of Acts, he goes up. The first chapter of Acts, Jesus ascends up. We know now another problem with all that is I think I said last week, we know now the way the universe operates. There is no up. So there's no heaven up here. There's no up. The ancients had the idea of a three-storied universe. There was heaven where the gods lived, the gods of Greek or Romans, whatever. The gods lived up here. We lived on the earth, and the devil was down there. Three-story, up, middle, and down. We know now that there is no real up or down. The universe, we're in it. So that doesn't quite work. And the idea that Jesus will come again and come down from heaven is problematic for guys like me. Now, people are very good, sweet character, believe in the second coming of Jesus. Fine. I don't know that he's not. They don't know that he is. So we just sort of agree. Okay, we don't know what that's all about. We're not going to fall out over it. Some people like to fall out over it. A few years ago, a guy that I had known named Tim LaHaye made buckets and buckets of money when he and a friend wrote a whole series of books called the Left Behind series. There's a snatch that they extract. It's called the rapture. And in the idea of the rapture, that at a point in all of this program of end time, the spirit that Jesus is going to come and rapture, take out the believers and leave non-believers on the earth. And so what the Left Behind books portrayed was Sammy and I are driving a car, and suddenly the rapture happens, and I'm the driver, and I get raptured, and I get taken up, and there's nobody driving the car, and so Sammy has a huge wreck in the car there. This is the idea of the rapture. That's the way they picture it. And these Left Behind books, I wrote 8 or 10 of them, were fictional. They were clearly fictional novels of that idea of left behind. And they sold a bunch of those books, big books. 2 or 3 of my best cousins read the books and just thought they were wonderful. And they are not second coming people, but they read the books. But the bottom line here, what Paul if we were talking to Paul in Philippi in 50 Common Era, he was absolutely convinced that any day, any moment that we would look up and Jesus would be ascending on a cloud to come back and take out the church. He was problematical from the very beginning, and it still is. So you can hear that all the time. You decide, I don't think it's a central doctrine, but some people make it central. But this is what he's talking about here. Our citizenship is in heaven. Now, you can make that a beautiful metaphor that we're in Phoenix in 2025, but in his metaphorical language, we're not really citizens of Hall County. Our hearts are with God. You know, our spirits are with God in the sense we are citizens of heaven in this spiritual metaphorical way. And I think we are in some measure. The interesting thing about the book of Revelation, it is we think of Revelation, Jesus coming down. It talks about a new city. And we think of our lives going up to God. But the book of Revelation talks about the new city coming down. That God is going to, in this end time, God is going to create a new world, they speak of the new earth. All is coming down, creating a new earth. So it's beautiful language. And one of the reasons I think the early Jesus group grew so well, where it was people were firmly convinced that God in Jesus was coming again soon and would take them out of the horrible world in which they lived. It was a tough world. The Roman world, in many ways, if you were not wealthy, was a tough world. And so you'd like to get out of it. Okay. So if we had a dispensationalist here with us today, he would probably have a stroke at what I just said. Which is okay. I mean, I don't want to have a stroke, but they're really good people disagree on this. The whole Seventh-day Adventist group, the term Seventh-day Adventist, the seventh day means that this group of really wonderful people believe that Saturday and not Sunday is the real day of worship. So they worship on Saturday. The Adventist part is they are really strong on the idea of the second coming. And they go to I've got to have some friends go to great length, particularly with the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, and to a lesser degree, the book of Ezekiel, to build that picture, that program of the second coming of Jesus. Okay? Is that all right? Does that throw anybody in a loop? So beautiful language, beautiful picture here. And you can see that if you are struggling to stay alive, that has some hope for you. You're a faithful follower of Jesus, and he's going to come and take you out of this mess. So that would have a lot of appeal to a lot of people. So those big pictures. Then Paul moves on, back up just a little bit. I think I mentioned this last time. On page 2, I think it's page 17, the way the number, second page here, he talks about Euodia and Syntyche, or Euodia and Syntyche. These were two women, apparently, who were very important to Paul, but who had become very crossed up in that little Philippian group and were causing trouble, causing disharmony in that Jesus group. And Paul is telling the other people of that little group to be nice to these women as they fight. Don't get tangled up in their fight. Love them back together again, because he says they love the gospel, they love Jesus, but I don't know whether one of them wanted the water cooler here and the other one over. You don't know what the fight was, but something had disrupted their friendship, which was also disrupting the fellowship and harmony of the Jesus group. So Paul is saying, help these women get back together again. Uh, on down in here, I quote, he says, do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. I've never been much of a worrier. I need to because Linda did all the worrying for us. If you needed somebody to worry, call up Linda. She'd help you worry back. Yeah.
So what's the worry?
Okay. No matter what, she always worried about me preaching, you know. She she never disagreed with what I said, but a lot of times at lunch, she would on Sunday lunch, she would say, now, why did you run up that red flag today? And I say, well, I didn't know I was running up a red flag. Somebody's gonna get mad at you. And I said, and if somebody's mad at me anyway, all the time, you know, don't worry about. But we still laugh about Linda worrying. What do you look like? Early on, we decided with our boys that we wouldn't care how long the hair got. We were not going to worry about hair. We were not going to worry about clothes. It was just not a big deal. But Linda did. You know, she would say, they can't go out looking scrappy like that. And I would say, yeah, they can. The two or three rules we had for them was you make up your bed, even though I mean just spreaded it up. You took a bath. You didn't go out smelling bad. Uh, you put your clothes in the dirty clothes, and you did your homework. Went to school and you did your homework, and you went to Sunday morning 11 o'clock church service. Not because I was the preacher, but because that's just a good idea. You do that. Uh, and, and Linda really fell in with that too. We didn't worry about very much how much their hair, how long their hair got. And sooner or later, they all had long, scrappy hair. And then they came in one day with a haircut. So that, you know, all of that. Uh, but he says, don't worry. Uh, and that's not an easy task, not to worry. And sometimes stuff you just can't get around worrying. He said, sometimes people read this to say, if you ever worry, pray and it will go away. He doesn't really say that here. He says, worry, if you worry and pray, you can find peace in that. Doesn't mean if you can't make the car payment, if you pray about it, suddenly you're going to be able to make the car payment. It doesn't say that. But you find peace while they come and repossess your car, you find peace. You know, I mean, that's ridiculous. But he's talking about finding the peace. There are other parts of scripture. A time or two, I'd have to look up the references in the gospels. Jesus seems to be saying, ask God for whatever you want, and it will happen. And that fosters the whole idea of what we've come to call the gospel of money, you know, that and the TV preachers used to say, you send me $10 and God's gonna give you 100. The I forget the word for it right now. And you know, that's a little snatch in there. I don't think that's real. Uh, if you'd asked for that, Jesus never would have died on the cross because he surely was not excited about dying on the cross. He pleaded, let this cup pass from you. Nonetheless, your will be done. So you have to be careful in there that just because you pray doesn't mean everything's going to be okay. But as you pray and have this kind of vital relationship with God, uh, life becomes much more manageable, and you have the bigger picture of what all is happening. Uh, so that's just a little piece here. Uh, and then I love this next part that I've put in bold here. He says, finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And the governing word there for me is think. If you want to be trustworthy and have all these other kind of things, it does not just happen automatically. Paul urges us to think, to put our mind into this. The other places he said he's given us the power of spirit and of a sound mind. You don't ever leave your mind at the front door of the church. The preacher that I heard yesterday talked about judge not that you be not judged. And then at lunch, we were talking about that. And I said, I agree with that. Judge not that you be not judged. But that does not mean that you don't have discernment. I may not like what she does, and I can say I'm not keen about what she does, even though what she's doing is pretty bad. I can have discernment without coming down on her head with a harsh kind of judgment. So there's a balance here to think about what we're doing. Well, this letter closes beautifully with Paul thanking them for a money gift that they gave him. I began to think about how did they move money in those days. They didn't have bank transfers and all the stuff that we have today. Money in those days was no paper money. China, I read in my piece, from antiquity, China had some kind of money currency, but the Romans and the rest of them made coins, and the coins would be out of a heavy metal of some kind, iron or something. But they would cut a little groove or cut a little hole in the coin, and then they would insert gold, little snatch of gold or silver or copper or some other kind of precious metal, and that insertion gave the coin its value. So you had a coin, the same coin, you could put a snatch of gold in it and be one value, silver. So when the Philippians sent Paul money wherever Paul was, they took up a collection and they put those coins in a bag. And then they asked Sammy Epaphroditus to take a ship and go over to where Paul was hurting and give him that bag of coin. And that was dangerous because he had the money on him. He had the coins on him. So he had to keep that very, very quiet and careful in there. Otherwise, some robber would come along and knock him in the head and take his bag of coins. So it was not just write him a check and send it over. There was a careful way that you had to do that, and they did that for Paul, and he was very grateful. Couple of things for me to kind of wrap up. You can take what you want. From the very beginning, in the very beginning, we talked about prayer. And I've thought a lot about that since we did that conversation about prayer. I like what we said. I like what I said. Prayer as community. Dean is having surgery next week. I mean, not you are, but I know about that. And I tell Dean, I'm going to pray for you as you have surgery. I don't have the picture of me beaming up to God and God beams down on Dean about her surgery. When I say, and I'm serious, if I'm going to pray for Dean, I'm going to do that. And whatever the mechanism for prayer is, I'm going to do that. And suddenly Dean knows I'm praying for her. We have a community. We have a relationship here. And I like that idea of prayer as community and prayer as relationship. The other piece of this that my good friend Pete Davis, who's here somewhere on the Zoom, who's a scientist, talks about, and we talked about this before too. energy energy is neither created or lost. We are all energy. We are all energy in our own form. So energy never changes. I mean, the concept of energy never changes. It can take different forms, but it never goes away. And so I can pray for Luke in the Ukraine, even though I don't see Luke and he's 5,000 miles away. And in Pete's lingo here that I cherish, I create an electromagnetic field between Luke and me. I create an energy field between Luke and me. He does not know that I'm praying for him. I create this field. And in that marvelous, unique, whatever it is, transfer of energy, I can bless Luke, even though he is far away and has no idea that I'm praying. And it helps me. It really was helpful to me a long time ago. You pray about things far away and they have no idea you're praying for them, but somehow or other we can create an energy field. It's something, think of another that I mentioned before, another great scholar that I knew of, I didn't know him, talks about love energy. Prayer is love energy. I like that idea. And also joy. Uh, the idea of joy is a big part of the book of a big part of the story here in Philippians, the idea of joy. What what sticks, if anything, in your head from Philippians or anything that we've talked about? This wraps us up with Luke. I mean, with Philippians.